We're going to start just with our introductions real quick, so we'll start over there.
My name is Henry Goslick.
I'm Brooke Weinstein.
I'm Ray.
Zach Desjardins.
And I'm Fletcher Monzingo. And so we're going to have Ray walk you over our perception of what the problem is with your or in your organization and how we addressed it.
Hello everyone, we are here to help you agency to better understand the electronic market. So we want to go to the case overview first. I want to point out the current problem first. And your agency is losing money dramatically because the electronic market is very huge, and you have the advantages and the potential to enter the market or further occupy the market. So our objective here is absolutely to increase revenue by entering the untapped market with a massive potential, and we do this through the e-waste program. This is how we can do it and why we can do it, because we have advantages. We have existing relationships between customers, we have existing network in place, and we also have a very low shipping cost. For assets, as I mentioned before, we have existing network in place. That means our poster server employees, they can visit homes at approximately 6 times a week, so it's easier to collect those e-waste things. And the second one is we have thousands of retail centers. That means it is very convenient for us to do some transition in terms of the logistics distribution. And we also have the ability to do the take-back program with a very low capital cost. The last advantage, or we can say the asset, is we have the active price of the letter carrier. That means we have human capital, and the human capital is very reliable. Okay, now let's turn to Brooke, and she will introduce the assumption and the limitations we have in our solution.
Thanks. So I'm going to walk us through our limitations that we have in place. So as you know, your organization has a limited amount of capital. We took that to mean a limited amount of financial and human capital, unfortunately. So we're a little bit constrained. So in terms of that, we can't really invest in a high-cost solution. So we tried to keep our proposal down to scale, reasonable, and worked from there. So these financial constraints manifest themselves in a few ways, obviously the obvious, but it also manifests in a reliance on evaluations from third-party organizations. From these third-party organizations. So we're going to work with these third-party vendors. We don't really have the capacity to vet them as well as we'd like, so we're going to rely on previously produced information to determine whether or not they're sustainable in terms of the environment, whether they're sustainable in terms of compliance, legal issues. So unfortunately, we are dependent on these outside organizations to do these evaluations for us. So I'm also going to walk through some of the assumptions that we have in place as we move forward with our proposal. So the first assumption that we made about your organization and our consumer base as a whole was that the average consumer will return their cell phone if given the option. We talked a little bit about something called the drawer syndrome, which we all could relate to. You have a phone, you don't know what to do with it, you put it in your drawer, because what else would you do with it? So we're going to assume that the average customer, if they have an unwanted phone, especially if it's broken, they'd get rid of it if given an easy solution to dispose of it. The second thing we're going to assume is that your organization does have the cost structure in place to pay for getting these phones to a third-party vendor. It's pretty self-explanatory. Our third assumption, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, is that we're going to assume that there are these outside organizations, these NGOs, these compliance organizations that are running data on the effectiveness of third-party vendors, like I said, in terms of environmental sustainability and in terms of compliance issues as well. Our fourth is that we're going to assume there is a steady growth in mobile phone sales. We have data to back this up in just a few slides, but we're going to assume that the sales of mobile phones are going to increase through the years. And our fifth and last assumption is that 50% of half of all consumers will partake in this initiative. What is the initiative? We'll get to that also for you guys, but in general terms, 50% of all consumers will put their phones in their mailboxes if we give them the proper information and reasoning to do so. And I'm going to turn it over to Henry now, who's going to walk us through some numbers on the projected market value.
Here, as you can clearly see, I have taken the previous 5 years of data and I have extrapolated the following 5 years from it. You see, I believe the last 5 years to be a very reliable indicator of the next 5 years because it was pretty steady. we had numbers around 10% growth, and for the next 5 years, for mobile device sales, these numbers will increase to 11, 12, 13, and 15% by the 5th year. But laptop and PC sales are expected to stagnate a great deal and in fact go down over time. This is because of the increasing reliance on mobile devices that we have in our everyday life and the obsolescence, in a way of speaking, of a static platform like a personal computer. There is a huge environmental impact that's going to come from producing these new mobile devices. There's going to be a lot of mining of raw materials. It's going to really affect the Belgian Congo, where coltan is mined currently, in horrible conditions. But through a program wherein that we are recycling phones, we're reducing the environmental impact a great deal. We don't have to go out and find these new mines anymore. We can get them from the pre-existing phones that we will be recycling and being able to reuse. These third-party vendors will be doing that for us. One thing that is changing over time is the half-life of the mobile device. When previously you might get 2 years out of a cell phone, nowadays you're getting about 12 months. And I think it is completely reasonable, and my colleagues back me up in this, that we could be looking at a 6-month turnover time in the future. And 5 years from now, having 2 cell phones a year is just going to be normal. I will now turn this over to Zachary, who's going to explain how we can take these projections of data and turn it into real money for you, our company.
Okay. Thank you, Hank. Alrighty, so in these 5 years, we expected there's going to be about 770 million devices are going to be retired. Of that, 727 million are phones. So you can see phones are the vast majority of devices. There's only about 51 million other devices, laptops and desktops. We decided, because we said that we're going to collect about, we expect only consumers will turn in about half of the phones. We're going to collect at a 50% rate, so we're going to collect 636 million of those phones. And the reason we're going to focus on phones is because the market trends, as Hank demonstrated, show that the laptops and desktops are declining. There's only 51 million of them, and it's much easier to process phones, at least in the beginning, than it is to try to deal with phones, desktops, and laptops. Anyway, so our total cost per phone of shipping is about $1.50. So just to ship those phones, it would be about 364 million. And we had to estimate what we would, based on the anecdotal evidence, that we would be able to get an average price per phone of about $2. It's a really conservative number. Some of the other anecdotal evidence suggested between $20 and $200. But this is our lowest cost, amount of revenue we can get per phone to actually make any money and break even. So we expected our total revenue would be about 727 million. And you take out your cost of shipping, and that's 352 million is going to be your extra revenue that you can either put into a PR campaign or fund your operations and otherwise. So now I'll turn it over to Fletcher.
You want to go to the next slide?
Yep.
So I'm going to walk you through our basic business operations strategy behind this initiative. And what we really envision your organization to be is the middleman between the customers with e-waste, what we call the e-wasters, and the third-party vendors. So if you'll notice, arrows go up and down. To get this initiative out to the public, to these e-wasters, we need to have a PR campaign. Now, we already have thousands of retail centers. We already have postal carriers carrying mail to people. We anticipate the cost of adding additional signs and information flyers to be relatively low. Now, the meat of the plan is that the postal workers will have an envelope that they will put in mailboxes, and people, when they have phones ready to be disposed, they will put the phone in the envelope, put it back in the mailbox, letter carriers will come, pick it up, bring it to their postal center, and then we'll resell it to third-party vendors. We are, do you want to get that from me? Thanks. We are potentially calling this program Your Phone, Our Problem. And really what it does is it gives minimal changes to protocol. So we already have the mail routes. There's no additional cost from pickup. And customers are already familiar with letter carriers. Most importantly, it's very easy on customers. So as Brooke talked about earlier, our customer market tends to have this drawer syndrome. And so what we're trying to do is bridge the gap between them putting it in the drawer and putting it on an envelope instead for us to pick up. So really what we're offering to customers is the incentive to get rid of their old mobile devices. For vendors, our incentive is to cover the cost of shipping and undercut what they're paying individually for these mobile devices. So we're going to sell it back to them at a lower cost and recoup the revenue we get from that, leveraging our resources that we already have. We do anticipate a few challenges. One is security. Theft of the phones is possible. More importantly, data security, i.e. the data that people have on their phones and how we need to clear it, is going to be important for many people. Consumer incentives, there could be apathy, although what we plan to do is have the PR campaign offset some of that apathy. As Brooke noted earlier, the third parties may be disreputable in the environmental world. So what we're really doing is relying on NGOs who operate in that sector and going to be using their reports and their analysis of how these e-recyclers deal with their products. And last is the administration and processing aspect, which I had mentioned earlier, printing the cost of flyers and new envelopes for people. Although if we hit the revenue targets that we have set, we believe those will be extremely minimal in comparison. So that is our e-waste initiative. We hope you have a few questions for us, and we will conclude there.
I have a question. You twice in your presentation mentioned a PR campaign, and the only thing I really took from it was the envelope in the mail that the carriers are going to drop. Could you talk a bit about some of the other channels or methods you're going to use in the PR campaign to draw people into the program?
Sure. So since we have thousands of retail centers, we plan to put up signs and things of that nature. How effective those will be individually, obviously we want to maximize our reach. So these days we have access to free platforms like social media. That's always an option to run a PR campaign on, and that'll reach X amount of people. Your organization does some advertising, although we don't want to push that too much because we would not want to add too much to the budget for that respect. Do you guys
Yeah.
go ahead, pick up something?
Your organization already is going to a lot of these houses on a day-to-day basis, so handing each mail carrier an additional flyer to put in the mailboxes is a relatively widespread and low-cost alternative to get the word out there.
And just one final point. These third-party vendors are currently doing their own marketing campaigns. We're offering them that for every dollar that they're spending on it, they're actually spending on 2 campaigns. They're going to be getting twice as much bang for their buck by campaigning for us in addition to their own service.
I have a couple questions. One of the things that I'm kind of concerned about is the sort of the difference between the smartphones and sort of the older flip phones. I just know for myself, I have a couple of smartphones, and I think I have a drawer full of flip phones. But I can't get any money, from other e-recyclers for my flip phones. So yeah, I might be sort of willing to pop one of those in the mail, but I can go and sell my used smartphone to another e-recycler for even $100. So why would I? And my assumption, although I haven't seen all of the data, so maybe you guys can enlighten me, is that the bulk of our revenue would really come from reselling the smartphones. So if our competitors are getting the bulk of the smartphones and we are left to mostly do business in, sort of the older technology, just curious if you guys considered that and if we have a potential challenge in sort of that dichotomy.
I mean, we assumed really low amount of money we get per phone on average because we knew that there are very different, so many different types of phones, and they have varying values. From your very cheap flip phone phones to very expensive smartphones, and that's how we arrived at that really conservative $2 per
Right,
phone.
at
That's
$2. So we have evidence to suggest that we could get at minimum $2
Mhm.
for a 1992 flip phone.
It's an average. So I mean, that's honestly, 1992 flip phone. I mean, frankly that's an outlier. I mean,
Sure,
but
sure.
Because
We're talking more, say you have Motorola Razrs still. Those aren't the 92 flip phones, but they do have some value, and we have evidence of that. So
Okay.
that's why we're averaging the cost there and keeping it at a low number for that.
Yeah,
Additionally, with the rate of technology increases, I mean, we can't predict what's going to be left behind in the technological battle.
Sure.
because we also point out that the value of the phone is also determined by the evaluation of the third party. So we just take the minimal
Okay.
value.
Just for sake of argument, you could melt down that 1991 phone and still get $2.50 worth of precious metals from it, and that third party would make that same offer to the customer.
So you guys mentioned that you're estimating that 50% of consumers will participate in this program. How did you come to that?
Anecdotal evidence, to be honest. There aren't really surveys out there, sample studies. We did a survey amongst ourselves. We all wholeheartedly agreed that if someone gave us a super easy option to get rid of our phones, we would definitely do it. So as of right now, it's anecdotal evidence.
and that's 50% over 5 years, not the first year, not the second year, but on average for those 5.
So are you anticipating that, okay, so on average, okay.
And we looked at the data. It says as of right now, over a 5-year span, 100% of people will get a new phone. So there's a high turnover rate, obviously.
And we're working off that. So 2013, that's the 5th year of one cycle of phones sold every year. It's the 4th year of one cycle of phones, the 3rd year. And so that's how we got our numbers of how many phones are going to be available.
Thinking about it from a process perspective, if we were going to operationalize this, I get the concept of, popping an envelope in the mailbox and then them putting it back in the mailbox, but how do we know, sort of when to give them the envelope? What's the, sort of initiation point from a process perspective? How do we understand where the needs are and deliver to those needs? So I assume we wouldn't be putting an envelope in everyone's mailbox every day.
Yeah, I mean, we could start off by doing our advertising campaign and let that run for a little while, however long our data tells us to run it for, and until we assume it's effective, and then we begin to put in an envelope in someone's mailbox, and we'll go from there. I mean, the cost of envelopes, since we're only incurring the cost of delivering the envelope, we're not paying for postage, quote unquote. It's not a huge cost for us.
But in the same breath, we don't want to be putting envelopes in people's mailboxes every day, so we do recognize that, and we are going to start this pilot program slow, whether it be one envelope a month or a cycle of envelopes, so that our consumers are familiar with the process as well.
Do you have any more questions you'd like to ask us about?
Your year one revenue projection, is that post-implementation? Is that the full year after we've got the program implemented? Question
Yeah, that revenue. That's
We need cash. Like, the premise is that I'm kind of questioning how long before we can get this program implemented and we can start receiving benefits.
Yeah, well, we did it the whole 5 years of how much we would make. And that was how we got that total revenue and that $2 a phone and whatnot. But the thing is, because the vendors are paying us for the phones, I mean, you're almost making money from the very beginning because you have that very low startup cost and you've got that revenue coming in really quickly. And that's actually why we focused on phones in the first place as opposed to laptops and desktops, is because phones are so much easier to handle and to start with, and we wanted to maximize that volume to really get that money flowing in, as opposed to trying to deal with laptops and desktops and bring them in. Not to say we wouldn't deal with them at some point, but we wanted to start with the easiest and something that would get us the most money quickly.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
One of the questions that I sort of have, since we have about a minute, I thought the point that was made about the sort of data security was a really good one. I hadn't really thought through that well enough. From the perspective of that data security, sort of process,
also had a very similar concern about that. Part of the reason I never give back phones is because I don't know how to clear them, and I have, you know, Bank of America apps on there and all that kind of stuff. So as you guys said, that's not something your agency can necessarily facilitate. That is something we would hope to work out with a third-party vendor. I don't really know about the process in place, but a quick swipe on their end, we could reassure the consumer that their phones will be cleared. From the third-party vendor perspective, ideally they have no incentive to not clear the phones. They're breaking them up or reselling them, so they need to really do that anyway for both of their reasoning. So that would be a big part of our efforts, are to ensure consumers that we will take care of their information. I mean, especially in this age where mobile phones have so much data on them.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank
All
you.